Welcome, everyone. Narita, if you could just confirm that we've had everyone join. Nothing had changed on my screen, so I just want to make sure we're ready to go. I seem to have lost sound. There we go. Natalie, I saw we started the slides. Everyone can hear me okay? If I could just get a nod. Okay, perfect. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. The State of the Economic Abuse in Canada report, as championed by the Canadian Centre for Women's Empowerment. We're really excited that you could join us today to hear about this and from our very knowledgeable panelists. So just as we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that for thousands of years, Indigenous peoples have inhabited and cared for this land we're on and continue to do so today. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land, live and enjoy this land, and by doing so, give our respect to its first inhabitants. We recognize that the Canadian Centre for Women's Empowerment, the CCFWE, is located on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. I myself today am joining from the traditional territories of the Six Nations of the Grand River and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I encourage you all to reflect on where you're located and the traditional territories of whom you are on today. So some quick housekeeping and opening remarks. Please do keep yourself muted. Zoom has a number of features and we encourage you to become familiar with them. And also, as you join us today, take any time away from your screen that you need. We know that the content of today's webinar may be triggering for those listening, especially those with lived experience. Please feel comfortable stepping away or utilizing the supports available through our support link. Welcome to the webinar. Please ensure that your microphone's muted. It'll help us reduce background noise. There is always the opportunity to utilize the chat when asking questions or write to our wonderful IT support, Narita, today. She's watching for all of your messaging to come through. Our session today is being recorded and will be posted to the CCWFE YouTube channel in the coming weeks. If you experience any technical issues as we continue, please do try to rejoin, and you can always reach out to us directly and we'll try and support you with that. We'll be sharing important resources and links throughout today's presentation in the chat function, so please keep an eye on those links and utilize and save them. If you have any concerns or needs for assistance, please message Narita. She's got a wonderful toolkit that she'll be using to help make sure today goes smoothly. We are going to have much time at the end for Q&A. So you can raise your virtual hand, use the Q&A features and functions or that chat function, and we'll be sure to try and capture all of your questions either during the Q&A or in a follow-up FAQ that will be posted to our website. So anything that doesn't get answered today live on the session, we'll be following up with. As always, we do encourage you to stay in touch. Follow us on social, CCFWE at CCFWE, and please use today's hashtag, which is hashtag State of Economic Abuse, hashtag economic abuse. So we do appreciate all of your shout outs and do our best to stay connected and tracked on social. We do have lots of upcoming events that will all be posted and shared on those various channels. So X, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and make sure to stay connected. As we move forward and get to our amazing panel, I do want to start with an acknowledgement. So the Canadian Centre for Women's Empowerment would like to acknowledge the many women who have survived intimate partner violence and recognize their courage, strength, acts of resistance, and resilience. We acknowledge the services and organizations that have worked with victims and survivors on their journey to safety and recovery, and those whose work is to prevent violence before it occurs. We are incredibly grateful for the support of our funders, the CCFWE's National Task Force for Women's Economic Justice members, partners, volunteers, summer students, and advocates who have allowed us to accomplish and achieve so much in such a short time. Together, we are supporting women and empowering them to find the help they need. Together, we are changing lives and inspiring hope. Special thank yous to the federal government's Office of Women and Gender Equality Canada and the YWCA Canada for providing the opportunity to conduct a national consultation of economic abuse to inform the National Action Plan on Violence Against Women and Gender-Based Violence. We would like to thank the Minister for Women and Gender Equality of Canada and the City of Ottawa for making the funding available to undertake this important work. We again wish to express our profound respect and unwavering support to all our Indigenous colleagues and cherished friends who have made significant contributions to the State of Economic Abuse report. Your invaluable involvement is so deeply honored. The report today is a report evaluating the current state of research and policy on economic abuse in Canada and globally. It particularly emphasizes the unique impact of economic abuse on Black, Indigenous, and people of color individuals, immigrants, physically challenged women, and communities. The report is available on our website. And to bring us into a more in-depth introduction of this report, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Natalie Snow. We're fortunate to have Natalie, an expert in domestic violence and economic abuse prevention, as our main presenter today on the summary of the report. Thank you so much, Natalie.
Thank you, Steph, for that lovely introduction. So good afternoon or morning, depending on where you're coming from. As Steph said, my name is Dr. Natalie Snow. So I'm the Director of Research and Education with CCFWE. We welcome you to our presentation on the State of Economic Abuse in Canada report. This is a comprehensive review of current research and policies, both Canadian and globally, on economic abuse. The report is up to date with the research as of summer 2023. So the aim of this report is to demonstrate the urgent need to address economic abuse and economic justice for women. Economic justice for women is not just a matter of fairness, but a fundamental prerequisite for a thriving and equitable society. When women have equal access to economic opportunities, the benefits extend far beyond individual empowerment. It is a catalyst for social progress and economic growth. First and foremost, economic justice for women upholds the principles of gender equality. It acknowledges that women have the same rights and capabilities as men to pursue careers, education, and financial independence. This equality is a cornerstone of any just society, fostering a sense of dignity and self-worth among women and promoting a culture of respect and inclusivity. The report also, part of the aim of the report is to provide a snapshot of the current environment of economic abuse. This is of the utmost importance for several reasons. First, economic abuse as a form of domestic violence involves tactics such as control over finances, withholding resources, or sabotaging a victim's independence. To understand the urgency of addressing this issue, a contemporary overview of the landscape is essential. First and foremost, the current snapshot of economic abuse helps shed the light on the prevalence and severity of this problem. By quantifying and qualitatively describing cases, we can better gauge the scale of the issue, assess the impact on survivors, and allocate resources effectively to combat it. Moreover, this snapshot enables policymakers, organizations, and support services to tailor their responses, identifying the specific vulnerabilities, trends, tactics used in economic abuse can inform the creation of a more targeted prevention and intervention strategies. This information empowers stakeholders to develop policies that are both proactive and reactive in addressing economic abuse. Lastly, it is important to understand how economic abuse impacts survivors so that policy, private corporations, and service providers can enact regulations to support women and children on their path to recovery and for women to achieve economic freedom and justice. So through Canadian research, it has been reported that economic abuse is a pressing issue that disproportionately affects various demographic groups. As highlighted in recent findings, Indigenous women in particular experience a startling level of vulnerability and with a threefold higher likelihood of enduring economic abuse compared to non-Indigenous women. This stark contrast underscores the urgent need to address disparities within our society and to ensure that every individual, regardless of their background, is protected from financial exploitation. We also need to look at the cultural impacts and the culturally respective intervention and prevention. Furthermore, statistics reveal that Canadian women with mobility limitations face heightened risk of financial abuse, with 26% of them reporting such experiences, in contrast to 17% without mobility limitations. This unsettling disparity indicates that physical challenges can exacerbate the risk of economic abuse, emphasizing the importance of tailored support and intervention strategies for these individuals. Notably, economic abuse is not confined to personal relationships alone. It extends into contexts like spousal and child support. This underscores the multifaceted nature of the problem, necessitating a comprehensive approach to combat it. It's encouraging to observe that over half of the social service agencies now offer specialized services dedicated in addressing economic abuse. This signifies a growing recognition of the issue and underscores the collective commitment to providing support and assistance for those who have been affected. However, further efforts are required to raise awareness, encourage collaboration, and support victims and survivors effectively. So within Canadian policy, Canada's approach to addressing economic abuse is at a critical juncture. At present, the country lacks a dedicated policy and legislation specifically aimed at combating economic abuse. This gap in the legal framework presents a significant challenge in adequately safeguarding individuals who may be subject to this form of domestic violence. Although Canada has made strides in recognizing the needs to address economic abuse as part of the broader issue of domestic violence, there is a growing call for more comprehensive and focused measures to address this specific form of abuse. One significant development in this context is the amendment of the Divorce Act in March 2021. The amendment mandates that courts consider financial abuse within the scope of domestic violence encompassed under the definition of family violence. While this amendment is a step in the right direction, there is a need for a unified approach to economic abuse in Canada, and one that extends beyond divorce-related matters to encompass a broader range of situations, including those outside of spousal relationships. In addition to the legal changes, several provinces and territories in Canada have shown promise in their work in leave policies. While they have implemented measures to address economic aspects of family life, paid leave averages only around 4 days, paid 4 days across the country. There remains an opportunity to enhance and harmonize these policies on a national scale to better support individuals facing economic abuse and the resultant financial hardships. Furthermore, the implementation of automatic child support renewal services in some provinces is a step towards simplifying complex issues related to finances within separated or divorced families, reducing potential avenues for financial abuse, and ensuring the well-being of children involved in such situations. These developments underline the need for a comprehensive and coordinated approach to address economic abuse and related financial matters on a broader scale in Canada. So as we've been focusing on Canada, we do see that economic abuse is also a pervasive issue across the globe, and it varies significantly across different countries. So in reports or articles from the United States, we see the alarming statistics that between 94 to 99% of service users have reported experiencing economic abuse. This widespread occurrence emphasizes the urgent need for comprehensive measures. In the UK, while specific data on the prevalence of economic abuse may be lacking, there are concerning indicators. Approximately 50% of women in the UK have reported being denied access or given restricted access to household finances, which can be indicative of economic abuse within intimate partnerships. This highlights again the importance of raising awareness and establishing support mechanisms. Contrastingly, Australia reports a lower prevalence of economic abuse with 11.5% of individuals experiencing abuse. This indicates that while some issues exist, it may be less widespread or known about in comparison to some other countries. However, even in regions with lower prevalence rates, it is crucial to continue efforts to prevent and address economic abuse effectively. Ghana, the Philippines, and Palestine, or Palestinian women, also grapple with economic abuse with varying prevalence rates. In Ghana, the prevalence stands at 23.2%, while in the Philippines, it ranges, depending on the type of economic abuse, 1.5 to 6.9%. Palestinian women face a particularly high prevalence, with 40% experiencing this form of domestic violence. These statistics underscore the need for global recognition of economic abuse as a pressing issue that warrants dedicated attention and support for survivors, irrespective of their geographic location. Some of the policies that we've seen is, and some of the research coming out internationally shows that the institutional perspective on economic abuse is a critical aspect of addressing this issue, and that survivors have reported that public institutions often appear less willing to intervene in cases of economic abuse, which can be distressing and discouraging experience for victims seeking assistance. Instances of victim blaming by the police or child services further compound the challenge, as these authorities play pivotal roles in protecting and supporting survivors. This highlights the imperative for sensitizing public institutions, ensuring that they recognize economic abuse as a form of domestic violence and that they respond appropriately and empathetically to victims. Traditional gender norms and roles also contribute to the challenges of recognizing economic abuse. These entrenched norms may sometimes perpetuate harmful power imbalances, making it hard for survivors to seek help or for institutions to recognize the abuse. In many cases, these norms place a significant burden on women who often find themselves financially dependent on their abusers. Certain countries have made significant strides in addressing economic abuse. In the UK, England, Wales, and Scotland, they have criminalized coercive control and controlling behaviors, which encompasses economic abuse. Additionally, the UK has introduced a finance code of practice, aiming to better protect survivors and guide financial institutions in assisting those affected. Australia has also adopted a broader definition of domestic violence legislation, ensuring that economic abuse is explicitly recognized and addressed within the legal framework. Similarly, Ghana makes specific reference to economic abuse in its policies, reflecting an increasing global awareness of the need to combat this form of violence, both institutional and at legislative levels. So besides this extensive literature review that was completed to document economic abuse across the globe, CCFWE included voices from service providers and survivors in the report. During February and March 2021, CCFWE, in collaboration with the federal government's Office of Wage and Gender Equality Canada and the YWCA Canada, conducted community consultations with grassroots organizations focused on gender-based violence and economic abuse survivors. The objective was to gather further recommendations, suggestions, and insights regarding the National Action Plan to end gender-based violence. So the objectives of these consultations were to amplify the voices of grassroots organizations, financial institutions, and victim survivors to end economic abuse, to understand the nature and complexity of economic abuse and develop solutions, and to provide concrete policy recommendations to the Government of Canada that will empower service providers and contribute to a transformative shift in Canada. So based on these consultations, several recommendations came forward to better understand economic abuse and support survivors. The recommendations can be categorized into these four categories: government policy and structures, financial institutions, policy, structures, and practices, research, and social service programs. Due to timing, I'm only going to cover one recommendation from each category. However, I encourage you to download the report and review the recommendations and see what you can do to advocate for change and how you can play a part. Under the government policy structures, one of the recommendations is to amend bankruptcy laws to support economic abuse survivors. The law doesn't consider trauma and violence, and that impacts survivor and how that impacts survivors' decision making and thinking. Legal amendments require working with violence against women organizations and legal professionals to amend the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act to address issues faced by survivors. For the financial institutions, policies, structures, and practices, one recommendation is to provide financial institutions staff with training on economic violence and economic abuse to better assist survivors in separating accounts and providing trauma-informed care when a relationship ends. Financial institutions are often not well-versed in economic abuse. And as a result of this, survivors struggle to manage the impacts of economic abuse, such as debt, bad credit scores, lack of money, and poor mental health. So the participants in the focus groups reported being unable to receive help for unauthorized transfers of money, closing joint accounts, and having access to empathetic support or special services for people in their situations. Bank staff should be trauma informed to better support survivors, including identifying financial abuse and risk assessment and safety planning. So within the research scope, the recommendation is to collect data on economic abuse as a form of intimate partner violence in Canada, and on post-separation abuse as well. Economic abuse and financial security data points are limited within the data collected nationally. Disaggregated data would provide vital information on the prevalence and nature of economic abuse, particularly how members of Black, refugees, Indigenous, newcomers, seniors, and gender diverse communities are impacted by economic abuse. Lastly, with social service programs, one of the recommendations is to improve access to legal aid services. Legal aid must permanently drop any family asset and income ceilings required to access legal assistance. Survivors come from all socioeconomic backgrounds, and when a woman leaves their home, it is likely that they cannot take all their joint assets, leaving them with little to no resources. On paper, they may not be eligible for legal aid services. However, their current situation they are living in is functional poverty. So there is not the ability to access these funds. The thresholds around income and assets were temporarily suspended during COVID for victims of IPV, and this should be a permanent change. Thank you for being here to hear some of the highlights from the report. There is a lot of information provided in the report, and I strongly encourage you to download the report and take a look. I'm going to pass it back now to Steph for the panel portion of our webinar.
Thank you, Natalie. As was mentioned, I do encourage everyone to download the report. The link was provided in the chat. And I do want to make a special mention that a French language copy will be available in the coming months. Currently, the report is only available in English, and we are working on that. I'm just going to also bring Natalie's attention to some of the questions around methodology that were brought up in the chat, and I'm sure she'll be able to answer those soon. So we're going to switch over to our amazing panel, and I'll make a brief introduction to the fantastic and accomplished women we have with us today. So we are truly fortunate to have here today to share their insights and experience a fantastic panel of 4 women. We have Angela Marie, the Executive Director of the Battered Women's Support Services, Amanda, President of Periage Group, Sarah, Assistant Professor at the School of Social Work with McGill University, and Messi, the Executive Director of the CCFWE. So as I move into some of our questions, I do encourage you to go to the event page and read more on the incredible portfolios of these women and the extensive knowledge that they hold as we move to our conversation. I know that the unique perspectives and wisdom will undoubtedly enrich the discussion we'll have today. Natalie or Narita. I'm not sure whose screen is currently up, but I just want to flash that that's being shared. So sorry about that, everyone. We're going to get those speakers' photos up again, and then we'll be moving into, I believe, just our conversation setup, where we'll switch into just the view of our panelists. Thank you.
Sorry for my minor
Okay.
technical difficulty. Just move ahead with the panelists. I'll put it up after again.
Perfect. Well, we're glad that I'm not in control of IT. That would have gotten much more wonky with my background screen. So thank you, everyone, for your patience there. Again, we have with us Sarah, Amanda, Angela, Marie, and Messi to share in this important conversation topic. So I'm going to start off with a question to Sarah. Could you please share a little bit about your research on economic abuse and how this research on economic abuse has progressed over time, and maybe tie that into the report we've seen today as an ending point?
Thank you so much, Steph. And thank you to Natalie. What a wonderful report. So thank you all for your work on that. And it's great to be here today. So yes, in terms of my background and my experience, I started working in economic abuse in 2010, and I had a unique perspective of being a practitioner before I got involved in the research context. So for me, this was really important to have that practice grounding experience. So I was working at New York City. In New York City at the time, it was 2010, it was post-recession, during the recession, and it was an incredibly hard time for survivors of violence to find jobs. I worked for a large domestic violence agency. Most of the clients we were working with were women who were either new immigrants or who were born and raised in the United States, many of them living in poverty or living in a shelter. And I inherited a employment program at the time that was rooted in the rapid response model of placing people in very low paid, low wage jobs very quickly. And this was the model from their welfare reform that they had in place. And it was really problematic. And as a newly minted social worker, again, as a practitioner who's grounded in social justice work, this didn't sit quite right. So I had the opportunity to work with amazing funders and other social workers, and we turned the program completely upside down. And we started to develop tailored employment programs for survivors. So we started from the beginning for folks who needed to learn more English so they could get a job, to getting their high school diploma, to getting an internship, to going back to university, and eventually to landing a job. And this was really grounded in living wage employment, a job that could get the survivor on her feet with her family, afford rent, afford food. We were not interested in low wage employment at the time. That was really that was the dominating viewpoint. So this really prompted me into a place of action. So a few years later, I decided to pursue my PhD to look exclusively at the employment-seeking experiences of survivors of violence and what services were in place, what were best practices, what was helpful, and what wasn't helpful, because services were sort of piecemeal. You sort of heard what agency was doing this, other agencies were doing that. So I was driven to take upon this as my focus, my research. And so I spent several years working with partner organizations in the US and Canada, completed my dissertation, and really got some great information there. And now sort of moving forward, and so grateful to connect with folks here at the CCFWE, because the research is going to continue now to look at economic abuse in a more comprehensive way. So we've partnered with several folks who are here today, amazing panelists, Angela Marie, who will speak later as well, and to Messi, and so many other folks from the organization, where we can look comprehensively at economic abuse across Canada, look at the risk factors, and work with partnering organizations to really make that connection between the field, what's happening in organizations, policy, what's happening at the policy level, and of course, survivors themselves, and kind of fill in that gap. So that's sort of in a nutshell of my research and how it's progressed. So it's been 13 years, and I look forward to the next 13 years to come of this work and how this is further developing. So just a quick overview of my experience. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. We can definitely see how that transition is tying into having that grounded research in the lived experience and what that means for the women that we're working with and working towards that different future. So I'm going to move just over to Angela Marie with the first question for her. So it was very kismet that Sarah pointed you out. But I'd like to ask Angela Marie, What are the trends you're seeing in the work that you're doing? And how are you seeing domestic violence and economic abuse survivors at the Battered Women's and the BWSS? Sorry about that. So please take it away, Angela Marie.
Well, thank you so much for the question and for the introduction to this conversation today. It's really helpful to see this research, and thanks for all of this data. It gives us a sense of what's happening globally and how we can make sense of that here. I'm here in the unceded and ancestral territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam people, and I'm honored to be part of this conversation and representing the work of BWSS that has been on the front line in working to end gender-based violence, providing support services for the last 44 years here in the West Coast, in Vancouver, in British Columbia, and through our advocacy nationally and internationally. And the matter around kind of economic abuse and what are the trends. The trends are consistent with the research that you've identified. There's nothing that we see that's any different than your report, in the sense of how prevalent economic abuse is, how challenging it is for survivors to access safety and to navigate within the relationship and in leaving relationships, and how much the entire economic system seeks to really create another layer of oppression for survivors. And we have to recognize that the Canadian economic system is based on colonial framework, which is about land ownership. It is patriarchal. It is capitalistic. And that is, in it baked in gendered violence, gendered racial violence that then impacts, as you've noted, Indigenous women very specifically because of the role of colonization and in creating barriers for Indigenous women to access land and resources, and in the Indian Act that just in and of itself as a piece of legislation that legally by law disenfranchise Indigenous women. And so I think about the notion of the trends that we see, but also just realizing that these are deeply entrenched systemic issues. And that when we're focusing on in economic abuse, we're seeing economic abuse for survivors. The statistics that you have in your report are consistent with what we've seen, in the sense that 80 to 90% of victims are dealing with an abusive partner that is leveraging patriarchy, leveraging those entrenched historical and legal and cultural disparities and inequalities in order to then really entrench power and control. And of course, we look at that in the sense of how we're now calling this coercive control, which economic abuse is a primary, one of the many matrices of violence that an abusive partner will do, that then is reinforced by the state, reinforced by the law, reinforced by the way that that the economic system is already set up to disadvantage women generally, and certainly newcomer women, Indigenous women, racialized women, Black women specifically. So the trends are the same. And one of the big kind of challenges that we have in sort of talking about intimate partner violence, domestic violence, is how it's just rendered invisible. We are coming through the last 3 years where we've had a tremendous spike in femicide, and a tremendous spike in reports of intimate partner violence, and this is across the board. And in serious cases, in the sense of violence, of injury, and there's been no action. Just a lot of hand wringing, I suppose, from our elected officials, and some efforts to kind of rally the call through social media, but there has been no structural changes, and we haven't seen that intervention that we expected to see through the National Action Plan that was designed from with lots of consultation all across the country, that is supposed to be a roadmap for a more just world and an effort to end gender-based violence. So that's why this conversation is important. This is why this research is important, and the recommendations that are in the research are important. And so right here in British Columbia, we're hoping that we can have our provincial government see intimate partner violence as a priority. Right now, it's not. It's not listed as as one of the policy mandates. We're hoping that it will. And we have to take the opportunity of the National Action Plan, and each province and territory is in their own negotiation with the federal government. Some have been completed, some are underway, but this is a really important time, I think, for our communities to mobilize as much as you can and to get in the face of your elected people provincially and then within the territories in order to hold them accountable for what is actually one of the very worst that humans do to humans that continues unabated.
Thank you, Angela Marie. I think you touched on some incredibly important trends on the report. Not only that there is those stark statistics in the report, but these are the lived experiences of the women. These are the impacts that our frontline support services are seeing every day, and the very specific point of the legislation leading to those lived experiences. We are in a multi-level context of legislation, colonialism, racism, all of these systems that are creating this oppression, and it's truly difficult to unmire, but the work is continuing. So as I transition over to our next panelist, Messi, when you think of all of these contextual impacts, let's bring it back to the beginning of the CCFWE. What was your motivation in building this organization that has led us to this fantastic report we've released today?
Yeah, thank you so much, Steph. I was motivated to establish on CCFWE in 2017. At that time, I had a private Facebook group, which is Women Was Impacted by Gender-Based Violence across Canada, close to 250 women. I had also lived experience at that time. So that was a very good opportunity for me to see, because everybody talks about the finance issues, and the economy is also one of the reasons, even to go back to their abuser. So that's a time, I have to take time, and then, okay, I have to do something, because as a mother, I have a daughter. I don't want to continue this trauma and then, continue these issues to the generation. And also in the meantime, I personally also have seen that agencies dealing with gender-based violence survivors, including women's service organization, settlement agencies, financial institutions, utility companies, healthcare providers, they often fail to identify and tackle economic abuse because of the complexity and then because of lack of the system. So meaning that survivors are still struggling with managing the impact of economic abuse, which is coerced date, homelessness, poverty, mental health, the discrimination specifically from racial inequality perspective. That really there's always a huge gap. And also, as you mentioned, it has a very profound impact, and it's long lasting, even if you're perpetuator, even though if not around. But this kind of violence, it will continue, especially women, if they go through bankruptcy, it will continue 7 years, your life. So this is totally injustice. And then I try to, explore a lot of opportunities. And of course, I lived in 3 provinces in Canada, but I never seen any education material, except there are a few agencies even mention economic abuse in their website. Probably Angela, that's also one of your organizations I have seen in Canada. So that's the reason. And then the reason I found. And in addition to that, specifically with Black, racialized, Indigenous, and newcomers community, finance is a taboo. It's kind of very cultural thing. And domestic violence by nature is a taboo. So so this situation is very complex for the community even to talk, because you'll be stigmatized, as the women, as the parents, especially for a single mom. So that's the reason I created this platform, and I created this movement since 2017. Actually, we were informally organized, but now we are organized, and as you know, it's a very kind of growing organization. So I hope it will amplify the voice of victims. It will also, help policymakers, decision makers to understand this issue, and specifically those agencies who provide economic resources like telecom, banks, essential service providers, insurance, mortgage companies. Because after all, these women are their client. They have a right to access those economic resources without structural barrier. As you know, racism is a huge part of this work. By the way, I'll talk, later. But that's the only reason, I created this organization.
Yeah, and I think we can all acknowledge the amazing work that has been undertaken since 2017, leading us to this conversation today. I do want to acknowledge that the chat is still very active. So Natalie is monitoring that, I believe, and there was an acknowledgement there of the complex newcomer experience with language as a specific barrier. So we're going to move to Amanda as our next panelist with a specific question around what ways do these cultural norms and stereotypes perpetuate the gender-based violence, and how can organizations and communities challenge these norms while promoting diversity and inclusion?
Thank you so much, Steph. I am so pleased to be jumping into the conversation. I've been sitting here and going, preach. Yes, I'm hearing you, to all of my colleagues around the table. My name is Amanda Periag, and I'm joining you today from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquins of Ontario. I'm a racialized woman who grew up in Trinidad, and trigger warning, growing up in Trinidad, the culture was very much around the normalization of intimate partner violence. When I was reflecting in preparation for remarks today, I actually had to check with a couple of my sisters to say, did we actually have these conversations? Because it was so very normalized. We had my parents often having conversations with aunties and uncles, because in Trinidad, everyone is an auntie and an uncle. Aunties and uncles sitting in the living room. Okay, so can we work this out? Can this not happen again? Very calmly, very normally. And we could name 10 to 15 aunties and uncles from when we were growing up whom we knew of. So norms and stereotypes are absolutely powerful, and we're completely grounded in them. And I so appreciated what Angela Marie was saying. I don't know if you could have seen me here saying, thank you for naming that we have these oppressive, patriarchal, colonial systems and structures that we are all functioning on top of. And this is why we end up with the norms and the stereotypes that we have, because they are being propped up and being supported through generations and decades, right, of crafting these structures. And frankly, when I reflect on this, I think part of the reason that it's so difficult to dismantle gender-based violence is because the very structure that's there supports it. So it's, you know, we're rocking the boat, but I mean, the boat is the boat, right? We actually need to, you know, pull apart this boat, and that's something else. So I think everyone here knows about what we're working with, the systems and the structures we're working within, and how these systems and structures are perpetuating culture norms and stereotypes. I mean, a lot of work has been done in the last few years around toxic masculinity, and I think more and more researchers are beginning to delve into the ways in which patriarchy and colonization are harmful, not just to women and female identifying folks, but also to men. I mean, for goodness sake, even in the Barbie movie, they explored that this summer, that it really wasn't so great for all the kids, right? So I think we know that the systems and structures that we're fighting against right now are rooted in patriarchy. And, you know, patriarchy is being screamed continuously at all of us all the time. And obviously it's very powerful. So how do we challenge these norms? Well, we have been challenging them. We continue to challenge them. I was chatting with a colleague recently who works in child and family services, and they used the word co-conspirator. I have been using the word ally for the longest time, and they said, you know, ally is great, but ally doesn't have any action necessarily attached. Co-conspirator means you're getting into it. You're part of the thinking, you're part of the doing. And I really think that change needs to happen with your co-conspirators alongside. Otherwise, I mean, I suspect each of the 76 of us who are on this call today, we already get all of this stuff. We already know what is happening, and we're right. We understand the complexities that we're dealing with, and we probably can see a path to what needs to be done to move folks forward out of, in this particular instance, economic abuse. But if you're going to actually dismantle, you need to be bringing in your co-conspirators. Listen, I'm often struck, and I promise I won't go on and on. I'm often struck by the fact that we craft the system by saying, okay, here's some laws, we'll put some policies around it, we'll develop some enforcement, and now we have a system, and we're all going to buy into this system. And because we're buying into the system, we continue to perpetuate it. The way that we start sort of dismantling the power relations and dismantling these cliches that are supporting hugely detrimental norms and all of the stereotypes that can continue to support gender-based violence is to start doing exactly what we're doing here. Have these conversations, push back against it, and say, actually, the foundation that we're premised upon, isn't that solid? And show the ways in which it needs to be dismantled. And the way that we do it while promoting diversity and inclusion is to have everyone at the table from the get-go, not as an afterthought, not as an add-on, but from the get-go. Because us folks, equity, deserving communities, we already come with answers, right? We don't need someone to deign to include us or, ask us for an afterward. We come with the answers because we bring this experience with us. Okay, I'm going to stop here, I promise, because I do want to hear from the other panelists. But what an amazing discussion. Thanks so much, folks.
Thank you, Amanda. And I think you bring us really nicely into the next question that I'm going to have for Sarah here, where we're bringing, those knowledgeable community members, those who have lived this, who, as you said, know the answers, have the answers, and just need that to be shared broadly and widely. As we reflect on the touch point that we already had, where the research speaks to the lived experiences reflected in the research. Sarah, I'm hoping you can highlight maybe some gaps that we're seeing in the economic abuse research. And then I'm going to tie this into a second part to that question, which is, how do we ensure that this research on economic abuse, which is such an important component, remains relevant, that it is responsive to these evolving needs and challenges that are faced by the survivors, that those are living this experience have that voice that remains central to the work that we're all doing? Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Steph, and great conversation. As Amanda said, what a wonderful time to be having these conversations and to keep this going. So as part of the first part of the question, the gaps in research, yes, so more conversations like this, more connections to organizations. I mean, to speak from the research perspective, because that's sort of my world right now, is there's a real disconnect between the research community and what's going on the ground. And we know, as Angela Marie had talked about before, folks who are working in the field, working in organizations, what's going on, what the problems are, what the issues are, what the trends are. It's often the researchers that don't know, and they need to be caught up to speed. And so there's a real disconnect between these two worlds, which is highly problematic. So a lot of this is sort of catching up the research world up to speed. It's connecting with universities, which unfortunately is not always our forte. There's only a small handful of us doing economic abuse research in Canada. There's a larger group in the United States, Jodie Posmuth, Amanda Stilianu, Adrienne Adams. So there's a small group of folks there who have been pretty robust in their work in the last 20 years, but Canada has really sort of fallen short. So thankfully for the CCFWE and your networks and your work, that you are really pushing forward a research agenda that I think is going to be farther reaching, because so much of this is done very siloed in back offices in a small research center in the university corner. So really connecting more with folks, doing more of these activities is really important. I think when I did a research literature review, there's maybe 50 studies on economic abuse. I mean, folks here probably know better and more up to date, but there was not a lot of studies out there. Yet in the stats that you put up before, 55% of organizations, domestic violence organizations, are doing economic abuse work. So how is it that there's so few studies out there that are looking at this, yet the work is being done in most of the organizations? So there's a real disconnect here. And we have to fill in those gaps, especially in Canada here. So there's a real opportunity to gain momentum to do this. So I think there's lots that we can do in that sense. And I think, so that was the first part of the question, Steph. I know that you wanted to sort of go into that second part. Did you want me to answer the second part, or did you want to give folks an opportunity to?
Well, I think if you answer the second part around
Yeah.
maintaining that relevance now, I think is a good transition. We are starting to get to the end of our time together today, and I want to make sure that everyone has time for a second question.
Great. So I'll just take a quick minute just to wrap up. But in terms of how do we ensure that research remains responsive, I mean, in light of the conversation here, it's not just about getting a job, or it's not just about opening up a bank account. It's so much more. So really opening up research that looks at these different levels of need in terms of survivors of domestic violence, whether it's at the individual level all the way to the structural level. I mean, folks talk about today, colonialism, racism, white supremacy, all these systems that make it even harder for survivors to get a job, to open up a bank account, to start a career, to go back to school. It's not just their experience with their abusive partner. It's all these other systems that have been so abusive for generations and generations. So it's so much more complicated. So the more we tease out these complicated notions of what economic abuse looks like, it's really looking at a multi-level approach. Individually, relationships, community, what does that look like, structural level, and looking into its entirety. This is a complex issue that is not fulsomely understood by so many folks who are outside of this particular conversation. So we have to kind of meet each of those needs and continue this from that intersectional lens that has been raised here, from a trauma-informed lens, because survivors and women are traumatized. They carry this trauma with them when they're looking for a job or opening up a bank account or going back to school. So addressing that and finally keeping up with that empowerment focus. So I know we use empowerment sometimes can be a buzzword, but empowerment in itself really is something that it should be the outcome of all these efforts. It should be to empower living wage jobs, being able to support oneself, being able to connect with community and rebuild someone's life. So that's, yeah, I think those are my final words, and I'll open up to other folks as well.
Sarah, that's an excellent jumping off point to return back to Angela Marie. When we look at teasing out those many, many layers of this complex work, in your opinion, Angela Marie, what are some of the key strategies that we can use to promote racial equity and financial empowerment as a means of preventing economic abuse in our society? How can we look at moving forward? How are we going to prevent some of these actions?
Well, I mean, I think the conversation around the National Action Plan is one piece in light of the fact that that's in effect right now. And I do suggest that all of us, wherever we are in the provinces and territories, that we get connected to the provincial association and to our other colleagues that are kind of in a space to advocate with the provincial and territorial governments right now. These deals are being negotiated as we speak between the provinces and territories with the federal government, and in order to fund which could be services for around gender-based violence over the next 4 years or in 3 years. It depends on when things get negotiated. That's a strategy that I think should happen right now. There's some urgency around that because there's some deals have already been signed. For instance, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, PEI, and Quebec already have some form of a deal. So that doesn't leave many other places. I'm not sure where Ontario is at, or the other, and I know British Columbia is in conversations right now. So I think that's an important big step. The other part is, and it's tied to funding, but it is really tied to funding, but it's also tied to how we're thinking about the issues. And I do appreciate that they're in the research that that was released today, that there is the report that was released today, that there is a recognition of how there's been a bit of an increase. I think I saw 40 to 50% perhaps increase in the numbers of services that are recognizing economic abuse as part of what's impacting survivors, and that are putting in specific kinds of supports around that. So that has to continue. But it has to continue from, as is mentioned, intersectional lens. But I think one of the things that we have now is it's a bit of a throwaway line, some of these terms, trauma-informed, intersectional. And I have to ask, like, what do we really mean about that at this point? And I think what we're talking about is anti-racism specifically, a deep analysis of colonization that has to be embedded in our service delivery. Incoming, or in Ginger Cat's arriving. He likes to be part of the show. so yeah, we have to look at the, what does intersectional mean? What does it mean? What does trauma informed really mean? And how we're applying that analysis. So anti-racism, a deep analysis of colonization, and in our service delivery, and and we did some research in British Columbia that looked at gender and race and service provision, both in terms of Indigenous survivors through COVID-19, and then racialized survivors as well. And so the first report is called Road to Safety, and then the second report is Color of Violence. And the first report we did in collaboration with the BC Association of Friendship Centers. And I think that that service provision has to recognize and build in analysis of race. That has to be a part of it. We really have to kind of build anti-racist practice that is embedded, and that means not seeing people as more vulnerable in the sense that there's something inherently wrong with Indigenous, Black, and racialized survivors, because there isn't. Rather, we're talking about a system that historically and contemporarily is disenfranchising through all kinds of attitudinal, employment related discrimination that continues. And how that's a thing that we have to do, and it has to be integrated, baked in. In other words, it's not a side thing that's over here. It's actually embedded in every single thing that we do. And I'm really encouraged by the fact that the service provision, and I've got to dig into your report a bit more to kind of see which service providers that are being reflected in the research. But it does encourage me that, because that means that the advocacy has been working, and in the sense of raising awareness of economic abuse. And but at the heart of the matter, everybody. The heart of the matter really is the economic model that's in effect globally and in Canada, and that is, capitalism, which does, as a structural economic system, does seek to have, some at the top and some at the bottom, and and creates those kind of barriers. And so victims of violence, in order to be a survivor of violence, means that we then have access to supports and access to safety, and knowing that abusive partners will use economic abuse in order to subjugate, in order to disenfranchise, and to leverage the way in which the state is already already creating these inequities. And so that's the part where our advocacy is so vital and has to continue. And I think that this research and this conversation, all the conversations going forward, will help to build those things that are working right now, and for us to really find opportunities to leverage our advocacy, which right now is a national action plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela Marie. And I know that this brings us back to, the middle history of this work with the person is political, and how we can really use our voices in this unique opportunity with the provincial federal negotiations, the National Action Plan, and raising that collective voice of all of our individualized organizations that we're working with when we're not here collectively with the CCFWE today, in making sure that we are seeing this raised in that conversation at that national level in a way to build impact, funding, support for these very, very meaningful work. So I'm acknowledging we're really close to time. We have just maybe if we go over for 5 minutes, those who have to step away, I totally understand. We're going to also have a follow-up FAQ. So Amanda and Messi, your time is a little bit shortened, but Messi, if you could speak to just one primary way that the systemic barriers are preventing the work, and what you would want to see as a means of overcoming those barriers.
So I think it's very hard to pick one system, because the system is very connected and then locked, because when survivors impacted by economic abuse, because it touched everyone, including private sectors. But what I would like to envision through my work and advocacy, I wish all the systemic barriers somehow kind of like removed for a woman, so that gives them a confidence at least to access their economic resource, because accessing economic resource is a fundamental human right and women economic right, because we need to also understand that. But now we have a lot of barriers. I think that's the most important work. And the second important work would be working on addressing those systemic and structural barriers, specifically for Indigenous, Black women, gender diverse folks, and racialized people. As you know, even in pandemic, we have seen many racialized people, even in Ottawa, face a lot of discrimination even to access a food bank. This is a historical moment even for me. I live in the capital city of Ottawa, but women, because of their skin color, because of their identities, they were discriminated to access food bank. This is so heartbreaking. So I think those are the most important thing we need to work. And then the other thing is, as you know, one of the challenge for advocate is, as you know, resource is very limited. Projects are funded in a short period of time. It's very hard for us to measure the sustainability and then to see the long-term impact. So resource is the most critical aspect of this work. We are a very small organization, but we work a lot of stuff. So that's also another thing. And then also we need to recognize this issue is very intersectional, especially for advocates. As I mentioned, it intersects with discrimination. It intersects by nature with a cultural and social norm. It intersects with also the socioeconomic status. So we need to also recognize the nature of this form of violence. And then the other aspect is definitely the system, what we have for survivors is re-traumatizing, because for survivors, what we learn, even through our advocacy and consultation, the current system it's very uncoordinated, it's not collaborated. Even we don't have any economic abuse prevention model in Canada, how it looks like, still we are working on that. So we want to work even moving forward to develop our own equity score map, specifically to address those economic barriers for certain demography. And plus, having that model, it really helps, number one, it enhances the collaboration, the coordinations of service among service providers. Number two, as well, women have a trust to have the system, especially those marginalized groups. So I think that also enables us to prevent re-traumatization because of the systemic things. And plus, that's also maybe, it opened the appetite for private sector. As you know, working with private sector is not uneasy, but glad at this time we have seen a lot of change. A lot of private stakeholders now, they are working with us. Thank you so much for our national task force members who works tirelessly with us, either banking and policy sectors. But in the past, it was very, very challenging. So I think the more we have a very strong system, we can attract private stakeholders to include gender-based violence program on their day-to-day work. So I think those are the most important thing I would love to mention. And plus, we need to also continue engaging decision makers. Decision makers, of course, they need data. That's very important. So we want to collect and continue collecting de-aggregated data. That's the most important thing. And then the other thing is, of course, decision maker, we want to see their action. Of course, we have a national action plan. That's great. Even the recommendations, still we have a doubt. In a sense, there is no any clear recommendation talks about women economic development, because we were participated in that consultation, but still the information is, it doesn't show any accountability from the government. That's also another huge thing. But we need to continue, pushing as advocates. What does it mean women economic security? What does it mean women economic safety? What does it mean women economic justice? What does it mean women economic empowerment? We need to have even defined those things properly in our program and policy. So I think, let me stop. I know it's 3 o'clock, I believe. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Messi. Amanda, if we just give you a quick, 10 to 15 seconds to talk about this overlap with diversity, equity, inclusion, and the way that we can ensure all diverse voices are heard in this work, really quickly.
Sure. I'll just briefly say that we can't keep asking to be included. We actually need to do something that's been done here. We need to do our own research. We need to demand that we create our own table. We need to show what happens when we're not included in that decision-making process. I'll leave it there.
I can just imagine the depths of what that very quick summation includes as we take back those tables. So thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Angela Marie. Thank you, Messi, for this amazing discussion today. I have 2 very quick summation mentions, and then I know that Natalie will work to ensure that all of the comments made in the question and comment box are captured in that FAQ introduction document that we'll attach to the YouTube channel when this is presented. So we know the importance of the discussion today has touched on such a range of what this looks like for those working in this space, and especially those who have experienced this and survived. Preventing economic abuse through system change is involving addressing the issue at so many levels, from legal and policy reforms to cultural shifts and community education. Addressing economic abuse is not just a matter of policy. It's a matter of justice and human rights. It is imperative to implement policies that not only recognize and address economic abuse, but also provide survivors with the necessary support and resources to regain financial independence and security. These policies should encompass legal protections, financial education, anti-racism, and access to services that can aid survivors in breaking free from abusive situations and rebuilding their lives, not just in that moment, but in the years after, as we know that economic abuse has those long-ranging impacts. Dismantling the deeply ingrained racist systems and practices in institutions and investment into equity. Survivors are seeking better coordinated, accessible, and trauma-informed services and supports. Removing these system barriers and achieving reform is possible, but it necessitates an acknowledgement and confrontation of the institutionalized racism. It gives rise to contemporary barriers. These are systems that are so fully ingrained and baked in, as we heard today. Furthermore, new investments are needed directed towards survivors, their communities, and their survivor-led initiatives. So thank you again to everyone today for participating. I want to acknowledge that if you or someone you know is affected by economic abuse, there are many organizations and resources available to help. The CCFWE has a resource page that can direct you to other organizations that have a more robust supports to work with you or those you love that are experiencing this. We're building out that website as well as have a number of resources available today. We are launching a new financial literacy support project on November the 1st. Our national campaign, Help Us Rise, is also launching on November the 1st. And our Banking Future Summit will be on November 16th. So please stay tuned to those social channels. Follow us on all of those various channels you might follow, and keep informed on this great work. We are paving the way for financial equity among survivors of domestic and financial abuse. This requires large-scale, long-term efforts, and we recognize that we are but one agency that has a role in this, and it's working to achieve this change. Please check our website, read that report. The French version is coming soon. Thank you again to all of you to this discussion. Don't let it end today. Please share your ideas. We're always appreciative of policy ideas, ways to keep that voices heard. And thank you again to all of our panelists today. Thank you, Miigwech, and appreciative of everyone who joined us.
Great, thank you, everyone.